All right, remember, we just gauge rake and we smoothed out using a smoothing paddle on our Param 6000. We're going to go ahead and polish this tomorrow. As an interesting option, you can actually embed objects into it, such as this glass. Now, the glass comes in different sizes. Basically, it's a glass aggregate, so we'll refer to this as an aggregate. You can get 0s, 1s, 2s, and 3s. Obviously, this is a much larger here. So what you want to try to shoot for is consider the depth of your overlay, and you want to try to pour a depth of overlay that's relatively close to the size of the aggregate like this. So for example, if I'm pouring a 1/2 inch thick and I'm using a number 1, which is real fine, it's going to sink down in. So as long as you have a light layer of overlay cement, and yet when you embed this glass, it more or less flushes out, that's what you're shooting for. Now, you can mix aggregates into the actual mix, but it's going to require some experimenting on the ratios. So typically, you don't want to mix more than about 20 to 25 pounds of aggregate into the mix. And when you mix it, you got to be very quick as far as putting it down so you don't get segregation, meaning the heavier aggregate is going to settle out and float to the bottom. So for this demonstration, we're going to broadcast a variety of both green and blue glass. Okay? You'll notice I'm kind of throwing it up because I want it to embed into the mix, and I'm actually monitoring how it's embedding, which it's floating out just about perfect. We're roughly at a thickness of 3/8 of an inch on our Param 6000. So what we'll do is when this is fully cured, typically next day, 12 to 14 hours minimum, we'll come back with a grinding and polishing machine, and we'll try to expose our aggregates that we're embedding. It's a matter of personal preference on how much or how little you put. You could go very heavy. I think for demonstration purposes, we're going to do kind of a medium broadcast. All right, we're here on our Param 6000 installation. 24 hours has elapsed, and now we're going to come back and we're going to polish this. We're going to actually grind it, hone it, and then polish it. So if you recall, what we did is we broadcast a decorative glass into the surface, and some of these chunks of glass are actually sticking up and protruding out of the overlay. So what we want to do is we want to do two things on our first grit, okay? What we're using is we're using a metal bond double segment, meaning this one tool has two segments, and it's an 80 grit. So even if we had a surface in which we didn't embed objects like this glass, perhaps an aggregate or something, we still need to grind the cap off of this overlay. This overlayment has a skin that's formed during the finishing process and the curing process, and it's really important in order to get a good grind, hone, and polish that you kind of break that cap off. And what we found works best is that we usually will use an 80 grit. In some instances, if we have to get down deeper, perhaps we've embedded some gears or sprockets or shells or terrazzo strips, we might consider going down to a 40 grit metal. Depending on your diamond tooling manufacturer, you've got to experiment to find out which sequence works best for you. For today's demonstration, we're going to start with a 80 grit metal, and then we're going to switch over to a double segmented 150 grit metal. And the logic is this. Basically, the 80 grit is going to leave a scratch pattern in the surface, and by jumping up to the next higher grit, which is 150, the 150 is going to theoretically remove the scratches that are left behind from the 80 grit. After we've run the 150 grit, we're going to switch over to a specific diamond pad that was really designed for polishing cement-based overlays. Now, different diamond tooling manufacturers have different variations of this, so you're going to have to check with your manufacturer, whoever is supplying your diamonds. But you do want to switch over to this style pad when polishing a cement-based overlay. So to recap, we've run our 150 metals. Now we're going to drop back down a grit and run a 100 grit to remove. In other words, when we transition from a metal to a resin, or in this case, this specific polishing pad, we always want to drop back down a grit to remove the previous scratches when you make that transition. So we're going to run a 100 grit, followed by 200 grit, 800 grit, or excuse me, 400 grit, 800 grit, 1500 grit. One other thing, somewhere within this sequence, I recommend that you apply a concrete hardener and densifier. Here we're going to be applying Hermitex, which is a colloidal silicate, okay? Now again, this is where you have to experiment because not all the diamond tool manufacturers are the same. Some will cut aggressive or not as aggressive. So for today's demonstration, if we weren't going to be adding color, I would probably be applying the densifier somewhere around the 150 grit metal, okay? So what I mean by that is I would apply it after we've run the 150 metal grit. I would, on a large job, I would vacuum the dust. I would auto scrub it so we're left with a clean surface. And then I would apply our colloidal silicate. Once that's fully cured, typically you're wanting that to sit onto the surface for 30 to 45 minutes. Generally on a large job, we're running an auto scrubber just to get any crystallized residue or any little bit of residue off the surface. If you over apply, it could leave a film on the surface, and if you don't clean that, it could load up on your diamonds, okay, on your pads. You don't want that, and that could actually promote scratching. So once that's been applied and cured, then we drop over to the 100 grit and go all the way up through the sequence. Now, where that logic does not apply is if you're adding color to the sequence. So again, you're going to need to experiment what works best for you with your specific diamond tooling and the type of equipment that you're using. I'm just recommending what's worked really well for us out in the real world. If we're using a water-based dye, for example, what we want to do is somewhere after either the 100 or the 200, generally what we'll do, because this material, once you cut it open, it's pretty porous. It's going to be very accepting of the dyes. We would run our 200 grit. We would apply our first application of our dye. Once that was dry, we would clean any residue off, typically by auto scrubbing. Then we would jump up to our 400 grit. We would clean the surface, apply a second application of the dye. Now, what is the reason for the two applications? It's simply the color intensity, that's all. Even applying dye after the 200 grit, this is still very aggressive. And when you run your 400 grit, it's going to remove a light layer from the previous coat. So I do recommend two applications. Once you've applied your second application of dye, then we clean the surface, and then we would apply our Hermitex concrete hardener and densifier, let that set for the recommended time frame, clean the surface, and then go up from there with your 800 and your 1500, and you should be left with a nice surface that's going to give you some gloss readings and have really good clarity. When we talk about polished concrete, or in this case, polished Param 6000, those are the two key factors we're looking at. We're looking at the clarity, which when I use the term clarity, it means how clear is the floor. We want to make sure there's no haziness to it. And you should be able to see overhead lights reflecting. If you've done a good job, you should be able to see the light filaments reflecting in your floor. So we have clarity, and then we also have gloss. And we'll demonstrate what I'm talking about. We'll take some gloss readings. And on most cement-based toppings, you're going to be getting gloss readings in the mid-50s. And in some cases, you might get into the mid or high 60s with your gloss readings. So those are the two considerations. Other than that, before we get started, I do get questions on, hey, what's better, grinding wet or grinding dry? And the answer is, it really depends on the surface that you're grinding and what your intentions are. In most cases, I prefer grinding dry on cement-based toppings. And really, you know, what's going to force me to consider grinding wet is if my diamonds tend to glaze over, meaning they're getting too hot and they're not productively cutting, I might consider misting some water on that in that case. Another scenario is, and this is more for traditional concrete, if I'm trying to get down quickly to expose large aggregate, or heavy salt and pepper. Basically, I'm going to grind wet because the diamonds are a lot more productive. It keeps the diamonds cool, and that little bit of water allows the diamonds to stay open and allows for more aggressive cutting. The only other two considerations, in some cases, we will get pop-outs. You know, we've embedded a lot of glass, and you might need to consider skim coating, you know, somewhere. What I would do is after the 150 grit, I would skim coat the material. You can actually use Scrofino Fine, and what you would do is you would dilute down the CP1000. You would probably go 4 parts water to 1 part CP1000 and put a tight coat down. Or you can actually use this material, sift out some of the sands, mix it with straight water, pre-wet the surface first, and skim coat a tight grout coat. Now remember, I'm not suggesting that you have to do that. It's only if it's necessary. So those are some things to consider. Once it's been skim coated down, you would come back and remove the residual with a 100 grit, which is still very aggressive. Okay? So we're going to get busy, and we're going to start with our double segment 80 bond or 80 grit metal bond diamond. We're using a machine that's powered by 220 single phase. On a large project, we would be using a much larger machine. And what happens with a larger machine, you get a little bit more additional down pressure, and oftentimes that down pressure equates to a little bit of a higher gloss. And then the last thing we'll do to finish this off is we will apply a topical protectant over that, and we'll show you how we burnish that in with what's referred to as a dip pad, which stands for diamond impregnated pads. And that final coat with the burnishing is what really takes this type of an application over the top and produces a beautiful surface. Now, unfortunately, we're working in a really tight, confined area, and so we're going to also show you some options with addressing edges. That's a big challenge in the industry. How do you address edges? So we'll probably put a decorative saw cut and show you some different mediums that you can consider. If you don't want a hand tool right up against the edge, like say for example there's a wall, you can put some decorative accents on the borders. Perhaps it's a skim coat of Scrofino with a stain or dye, or even a metallic epoxy combined with this is a really nice addition to your polished concrete overlay. All right, let's get busy.